Okay, we're going to go faster than Zeus's lightning bolts as we go through 0-4, which is classical Greece and Rome. And this might seem like false advertising, but before we start with Greece and Rome, we're actually going to start with Persia. Yes, a non-Roman, non-Greek society. You might remember that Persia is basically a Greek term that we use to describe ancient Iran. The ancient Iranians have always called themselves Iranians, by the way. So I'm going to use the term Persia and Iran interchangeably, but they basically mean the same thing. So remember that Mesopotamia is basically playing this constant game of King of the Hill, where empires rise, empires fall, empires rise again, fall again, etc., etc. Well, eventually what happens is after the Babylonians build an empire for the second time, for those of you who know a little bit about the Bible, this is that time period during the reign of like Nebuchadnezzar called the Second Babylonian Empire, or the Chaldean Empire. But any hoodles, a bunch of rednecks in the upland hill country of Iran, called the Medes and the Persians, rise up and basically conquer most of the Second Babylonian Empire. So as it turns out, that these hill fighters are actually extremely competent at fighting, and they bring with them a monotheistic or duotheistic religion that we call Zoroastrianism. Remember that Zoroastrianism is a religion where there's one good god, one bad god, and the idea is that if you're on the side of good, you're going to be honest, truthful, and also the Zoroastrians, and this is really metal, love fire. So on the flip side, remember that most of the other societies around Mesopotamia and even classical Greece practice a religion that we would consider polytheism, right? Zoroastrianism is a religion that not only is duotheistic, it also has a moral code. You're supposed to do good things. You're not supposed to be a monster creepo like Zeus, for example. Anyway, when the Persians come to power, they very quickly create this extremely large empire, and a lot of their empire is ruled by local governors called satraps. You might remember we use the term vassal state to describe a state that's given lots and lots of local autonomy. You can kind of think of the Persian Empire as a collection of different vassal states. So Egypt, for example, becomes a vassal during the Persian Empire. Large quantities of this territory right here, called Anatolia, becomes a vassal of the Persian Empire. One of the things that the Persians are very good at, and may have also inspired Rome to do the same, is the construction of a massive road project. Roads are not only great for facilitating trade, and not only great for facilitating just general transportation, but also great for facilitating the move of armies from point A to point B. So this makes the Persian economy and the Persian military positively overpowered. First ruler of the Persian Empire was this dude by the name of Cyrus, also known as Cyrus the Great, and actually, yeah, this is one of those few examples where pretty much everybody believes that he was great. He seemed to be a pretty chill guy, granted religious toleration for pretty much everybody, and apparently charmed the Jewish people who had been kept in Babylon since basically the emergence of the Second Babylonian Empire, that the Jews in Babylon basically anoint him or call him an actual Messiah. One of the reasons they do that is because Cyrus actually allows the Jewish people to return to their homeland, and it's one of those, for that reason, that historians anticipate or suspect that a lot of Judaism incorporates Zoroastrian concepts. Anyway, so then what happens is Cyrus goes off on a military campaign and may or may not get himself killed by Amazons. The history there is a little dodgy. So at this point, there's like a succession crisis, but eventually depending upon how you look at it, either a descendant of Cyrus or a military general by the name of Darius sort of consolidates Cyrus's empire. Cyrus is a great empire builder. Darius is a great empire consolidator. In other words, he's focused on kind of keeping what Cyrus has basically built. He's the one who builds the royal road, and he also starts to consolidate control in the fringes of Persia's empire. Now, the further you go from the center of an empire, the more likely you are to get uprisings and pushbacks from the native population. This is especially the case in this part of the world right here, Anatolia. So Anatolia is very diverse because on the one hand you have a civilization that's very adjacent to the Mesopotamian world. But at the same time, you have Greek-speaking peoples who have settled along what we call the Ionian coast right here, and have lived there for, at this point, hundreds of years, if not thousands. So what happens is that there is a revolt in these areas. And this revolt was kind of sort of started or helped by the Greek city-state of Athens. Now, if you are the great king of the Persian Empire or the great leader of any empire, you have a couple of very specific jobs. One job is to look and act tough. You're supposed to command your army and be very, very good and effective at beating people up, especially people who disagree with you. So now Darius is a problem. The Athenians have tried to rip his empire apart, and the question is, if you're a great king, can you just let that pass? And the answer is obviously no. So Darius begins to get together an expedition that's going to be sent to punish Athens. He does that in and around the 5th century BC. And Darius's army is basically ambushed at an area called Marathon. Of course, because of the travels of Phidippides, who was busy trying to kind of ask allies for help, it is for this battle that we actually get the term marathon for, the actual race. But anyway, the attempt to punish Greece doesn't go that well. So if you're Darius, can you let that go? Well, now you're even more humiliated. So now you're going to make sure that you're going to doubly punish Greece. And this time you're not going to leave anything to chance. Darius begins putting together this massive expeditionary army. But before he can lead it and send it, well, he kicks the bucket. But his son Xerxes manages to lead the expedition. So he invades Greece, and things go pear-shaped pretty much from the very beginning. The other Greek city-states actually end up helping Athens for the most part. Some will support the Persians, looking at you, Macedonia. But for the most part, they stay and they actually cobble together like an alliance to resist Persia. So first off, the Greeks actually stand and fight at the pass at Thermopylae, as depicted in the movie 300. And that gives their fleet enough time to basically gather together, and they ambush the Persian fleet at a place called Salamis. So at the Battle of Salamis, the Athenian navy comes in and basically destroys most of Persia's fleet. And from that point onward, Persia can't sustain an invasion. There's a follow-up battle at a place called Plataea, where the rest of the Persian army is destroyed. But basically, Persia goes into this war with almost every advantage imaginable. The largest army that had probably ever been assembled in the world at that time. And they just fall flat on their face. So, Athens gets a lot of street cred because of this, and manages to put together this military alliance called the Delian League. The idea is that if you're a Greek city-state and don't want the Persians to come in and gobble you up, well, you can join this super awesome club of powerful Greek city-states, most notably led by the city-state of Athens. However, everybody knew that Athens basically had the most power here, and it's really because of the Athenian fleet that Greece was going to be protected. So basically, if you join this alliance, it almost is like a protection racket, because you either have to provide the Athenians with ships, or you have to provide them with moolah. So you could argue that a lot of the Greek city-states during this time period also become vassal states of Athens. The Delian League is a slow, steady way that Athens actually builds its own empire. So, speaking of Greece, if Egypt is the product of the Nile, Athens is the product of a bunch of these darn hills. It is hilly, rugged. The terrain means that it's very difficult for cities to communicate or trade with one another. And so, in Greece, unlike in Mesopotamia, you had these very powerful city-states with their own unique identities, cultures, even dialects. And these city-states were constantly feuding and squabbling with one another. Um, so obviously, when we're talking about Greece, we're not talking about Greece as a nation state. We're talking about Greece as a group of people that kind of speak the same language, sort of worship the same gods, but there's not really much more connection to it than that. In fact, the Persian Wars might be the first time that Greeks are actually thinking about the fact that being Greek matters because of an exterior invader, right? The most famous of the Greek city-states, though, are Athens and Sparta especially, but also Corinth, Megara, Argos, Olympia, for obvious reasons there, and Thebes. Also, just like how India is, or Indian civilization goes well beyond India itself today, that is also true for the Greeks. So the Greeks established colonies everywhere from southern Turkey, parts of southern Ukraine, actually, southern Italy. They even established a colony over what is today modern day Marseille, France. So the Greeks get out a lot. So, as you might know, the Greeks give us a lot of our foundational political ideas. Most notably, they give us the concept of what is a democracy, which means rule by the people. Even though Athens has an aristocracy and there's a lot of what we call income inequality in Athens, the fact is that Athens, for most of its history, was a pretty vibrant democracy, except for the fact that roughly 50 to 60% of the population was enslaved at any given time. On the other hand, you have the Spartans, and, well, not just the Spartans, but most notably the Spartans that had this government system called oligarchy, which means rule by the few. The Spartans are a society in which everything is heavily based around social class. And basically, in Sparta, it's not all that different from feudalism. You have an elite warrior class that basically governs everything. They're not knights, but they're basically called Spartiates, which are the elite warrior class. So, yeah, it's basically feudalism with a couple of extra twists that we'll maybe talk about later. Because of the victory that Athens won for itself after the Battle of Salamis and the end of that Persian campaign, Athens enters this golden age where it is basically accruing massive amounts of money because of the Delian League. And so it turns around and actually spends that on art, culture. So, for example, the Acropolis in Athens, this is the time period where that kind of becomes especially like bougie. This is also the same time period, by the way, where you have Greek thinkers like Socrates and Plato. This is the time period where you have these very famous playwrights like Sophocles, Aeschylus, it's a few others like that. It seems like for whatever reason, the planets align and you get these incredibly prolific people at the same time in the same place. So that's Athenian democracy. We've already talked a little bit about Greek philosophy. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth there, but remember, Socrates, he's the guy who is more just trying to get people to question things. Plato is the guy who's kind of the dreamer who believes in this world of the forms. Also devises this ideal society ruled by philosopher kings. Well, ideal for him, right? I mean, he's a philosopher. You ask a philosopher what their ideal society is, well, wouldn't you know it? Like, it's a society ruled by philosopher kings. So, interestingly, actually, we also talked about Aristotle. He teaches Alexander the Great, but what I really want you to know about him, again, is that he is known for the development of logic, and he becomes the dominant intellectual, force in both Western Europe, or just all of Europe, and actually a great deal of the Middle East throughout Dar al-Islam. Aristotle is just kind of considered the OG. The trouble with golden ages, just like the trouble of everything else, is that it can never last, at least not forever. So there is friction between Athens and Sparta. Sparta is kind of the old power. It's a traditional power that prioritizes military force and oligarchy. Athens prioritizes trade, a strong navy, and democracy. And eventually, due to disputes over the control of city-states in Greece, Athens and Sparta entered this very long, devastating war called the Peloponnesian War that divides most of Greece into two camps. So now the Greeks aren't joining forces to fight the Persians. Actually, the Greeks are basically entering like this civil war. So at first, the Athenians do fairly well. The Athenians are dominant at sea. The Spartans aren't really able to use their military advantages on land that much. But what happens is we get the Athenian population retreating from the countryside, away from the Spartan army, and into the city proper. And the thing is that when you have a city that like doubles in size, that also doubles your problems, including doubling the threat of disease. So as far as we can tell, Athens during this period receives its first, but not only dose of the bubonic plague, which kills maybe up to half of the Athenian population. Athens never really recovers from this. And in fact, Pericles, the major military leader of Athens and the symbol of its resistance to Sparta, kicks the big one because of the bubonic plague. So from that point on, Sparta seems to sort of gather the momentum and starts to push the Athenians back. Wars very rarely result in very clear winners, but I would say that the wars that most regularly produce losers would be civil wars. Even though the Spartans win the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans are so gutted and so devastated by the war itself that they also never really recover. And so now there's like this ambiguous period in Greek history where a couple of city-states try to emerge to kind of fill the gap left by Athens and Sparta. Thebes tries to do this, but none of them really stick until we actually get the redneck Greeks up in Macedon, led by this guy called Philip II. Philip II was not actually considered Greek by the other Greeks, but if you ask Philip II, he was Greek, right? The Macedonians spoke a Greek dialect, but it's probably fair to say that the Macedonians themselves have a very different society. Macedon itself isn't as hilly as Greece. They also have a society that's rooted more in pastoralism, lots of herding. They ride horses a lot. The Greeks never really did. So the Macedonians have basically been chilling out on the edge of the map for most of the last, century. And they've been quietly gathering up strength. And now that everything in Greece looks weak, Philip II, the king of the Macedonians, sees his opportunity, and he basically comes in and, conquers all of Greece. But, Philip II mysteriously dies for reasons that I'm sure have nothing to do with the fact that he was about to disinherit his eldest child, Alexander. Anyway, towards the end of his life, Philip sort of has this dream of basically taking a Greek army with himself at the head of it and conquering Persia. Because, where you go after conquering all of Greece? Well, Alexander basically picks up that same task, except that he does it very, very well. He manages not only to beat the Persians in battle, he manages to dismember, cannibalize the Persian Empire. Though what's interesting is that you could look at it two different ways. You could see that, or argue that Alexander conquers the Persian Empire from the outside by destroying the Persian armies, which he certainly does that and is pretty good at it. You could also see that, Alexander doesn't really change a lot of the infrastructure of the Persian army or Persian Empire. He basically just takes the system that he finds and puts himself at the head of it. So you can argue that what kind of happens is that maybe the Greek Empire and the Persian empires kind of merge together. Alexander certainly certainly believes in things like cultural diffusion and syncretism. He's known for his religious tolerance. But he doesn't have a lot of time to consolidate because Alexander sees himself first and foremost maybe more as an adventurer than a real conqueror. He wants to get to literally the end of the world and basically make it further than any other Greek person has up to this point. Anyway, they make it all the way to India, and at that point, his army basically mutinies and says they want to go home. Alexander gets really upset and says, okay, fine. So he returns to the new capital at Babylon, which more or less is where Baghdad is, where he either, depending upon your assumptions, is either poisoned by somebody, gets malaria, or basically drinks himself to death. But in just a couple of decades, Alexander manages to piece together one of the largest empires in world history. He pieces together this Greek empire that doesn't really last that long. In fact, as soon as Alexander dies, basically the empire splits off into 4 parts. But when they split into 4 parts, those 4 separate parts remain Greek. You have Greek culture spreading to Egypt, to the far reaches of Afghanistan, to parts of Iran. Greek culture, Greek language is spreading everywhere, and we call this the Hellenistic Age. Star this, underline it, etc. This slide says that it ends in 146 BCE with the conquest of the Greek peninsula by Rome. That is stupid. I disagree with that significantly. The Hellenistic Age doesn't really end. It basically just merges with an age created by Rome. Greco-Roman culture sort of fuses together over the next couple of 100 years. So, speaking of the Romans, imagine a world where the city of Meisenheimer conquers the United States of America, and everybody from New York to Hawaii to Alaska, everybody in those areas are known as Meisenheimerians. Oh, let's just hope Meisenheimer doesn't actually conquer the United States then. If you think that's absurd, well, yeah, it is absurd. But basically, that's what Rome does. Rome starts as this small, unremarkable town with a population probably about that of Meisenheimer, and manages not only to conquer all of its neighbors, but to create one of the largest and certainly one of the most enduring empires in world history. Rome is one of those empires that's important not just because of what it does in its own existence, but the fact that so many people constantly harp back to the Roman Empire and try to emulate it. Whether you're looking at the Byzantine Empire in the Middle Ages or the Holy Roman Empire that lasts all the way to the 1800s, the Roman Empire has some legs. Rome grows up in a pretty tough neighborhood. Basically, every major city-state surrounding Rome is larger and more powerful, also more technologically advanced. You have pretty advanced Greek city-states down here. They're surrounded by the more sort of culturally sophisticated Etruscans. And the Romans, and to be honest, we don't even call them Romans yet. We'll call them the Latin people. The Latins are kind of considered backwards. They're farmers. What they do, however, is they kind of go the Assyrian route, where they basically create a state that is focused on war and war making. To that end, they create a government called the Res Publica. Eventually, we just call it the Republic. But at first, the Republic is actually based on the Spartan government, and the Spartan government was in itself based on war making. So everything about Rome was focused on fighting and carrying out successful military campaigns. And so slowly but surely, they basically engulf and assimilate most of their neighbors over a period starting from around 753 BC, which is the specific date that the Romans basically date the founding of their city, all the way to roughly the 200s BCE. In and around the 200s BCE, you actually have kind of like World War II in the Mediterranean. You got the 2 dominant powers, the Romans and the Carthaginians. This is almost like a repeat of the Peloponnesian War. You have the incredibly mercantile, trade-savvy Carthaginians with their large overseas empire versus a more traditional landed power like Rome. Rome wins, and Rome actually wins much more decisively than the Spartans do during the Peloponnesian War. The Romans fight count them, 3 wars against Carthage. And just to show you the level of spite and how extra try-hard the Roman Republic is when fighting in war, during the Third War, apparently the Romans actually salted the soil of Carthage itself to ensure that nothing else would grow in its place. Speaking of metal, that's pretty metal. So, after the Punic Wars, Rome goes from being a republic to having an overseas empire. But its political system is more or less still the same system that had existed from the 500s BCE. Now, the thing is that the Roman government itself, the Roman Republic, was basically a government that was designed to run a city. It wasn't really designed to run a large overseas empire. But you have political problems that stem because of that. So because it was now essential to have large permanent armies stationed overseas, led by commanders that knew what they were doing, you have this period where military commanders and generals become the major power brokers of the Roman Empire. The most powerful and noteworthy of them is of course Julius Caesar. Under Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire has a very long and devastating civil war, but it's worth noting that the Romans actually have lots and lots of civil wars. Caesar's civil war just happened to be a point where a lot of Romans just knew that the republic that they knew had just sort of collapsed. Caesar declares himself dictator in perpetuity. He doesn't declare himself king, but basically all power stems from Julius Caesar. Roman traditionalists are basically creeped out enough by that they have him assassinated. And even though they assassinate Caesar to prevent an all-powerful leader from taking over the government, that's basically what happens anyway. Power passes from Caesar to his nephew, a kid by the name of Octavius, and then he later on becomes Caesar Augustus. There is yet another civil war that is fought between Augustus and one of Julius Caesar's former BFFs/generals, Mark Antony, who apparently has also, apparently consoled Julius Caesar's ex-girlfriend, Cleopatra of Egypt. But the civil war ends with Augustus winning a decisive victory. This leads to this period of the Pax Romana, which is this rough period from 27 to 180 27 BCE to 180 CE, where the Roman Empire is generally at peace. You still actually have some civil wars because of who gets to be emperor. Actually, I think it's when the Emperor Nero comes to power, it's called the Year of the Four Emperors, because literally you have 4 different claimants to the throne that all sort of kill each other in quick succession. But for the most part, things are stable. You have trade and infrastructure based around Roman roads and protection of the Mediterranean. You have Roman coinage. You have connections to the Silk Road. Latin and Greek become common languages. And danger on the highways and danger on the high seas decreases pretty significantly. So it's in that environment that between 7 to 2 BCE, we have Jesus born in the Roman province of Judea. It's worth noting that Jesus is one of many what we would call Jewish apocalyptic leaders. In other words, Jesus, not necessarily saying that Jesus was calling for the end of days, but Jesus, one of the points of his ministry was that he constantly said, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near, right? I mean, that kind of sounds pretty serious. But Jesus was also incredibly good at not openly defying Roman authorities. And so unlike lots of other religious leaders, he's not actively persecuted, at least at first. If this is where things kind of become a little tricky, because on the one hand, if you were Christian, The reason for this, the reason for the fact that Jesus, for Jesus living this long is the fact that he is the Messiah, and so therefore he has the chance given to him by God to spread his message until he is called back to heaven. If you look at it from let's say, a non-religious perspective, like a historical perspective, I still think you have an interesting story. The story that you get is that Jesus is a really smart dude. Jesus is somebody who is very lawyerly. He knows just what he can get by with without the Roman or local authorities arrest him on charges of blasphemy or essentially inciting people against the state. So Jesus also had to have been pretty bright, because if the stories are to be believed, he was apparently debating with rabbinical leaders at like the age of 12. Rabbinical leaders are people who spend their entire lives studying the Torah, the Old Testament, and so the fact that Jesus could not just debate with them, but also basically defeat them, that's pretty significant. And also it probably means that Jesus could speak multiple languages, was very literate, had been literate from a very early age. Again, it's just kind of an interesting portrait. Under the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire stretches from Egypt and parts of the Mesopotamian all the way to the border of Scotland. But also the unification of this territory into one state also makes it much easier for goods to spread, for armies to move, and for religions to spread. So you've got a large state. Things aren't monolingual, but a lot of people speak Latin and Greek now. And so this allows Christianity to spread like wildfire in the first couple of centuries after the death of Jesus. So this is in spite of the fact that Rome goes through several periods where the state actively persecutes Christians. The issue, though, is that Christianity has a lot to say for the lower classes, and Rome had a slave-based economy where at any given time, roughly 50% of the population was probably enslaved or indentured in some way, shape, or form. So Rome has one of these civil wars in the 300s where you have several different claimants for the throne. You have Constantine, a Roman general, fighting another Roman general by the name of Maxentius. And apparently Constantine has a dream that if he paints the symbol Chi Rho on the shields of his troops, that he will receive victory. So at the battle at the Milvian Bridge, which is right smack dab in the middle of Rome, I think, Constantine's troops win, and the troops of Maxentius basically peace out. So Constantine adopts Christianity personally. Christianity does not become the official religion of the Roman Empire just yet, but it does become an officially recognized and tolerated religion of the Roman Empire. He also creates a second imperial capital located at Byzantium, which may or may not have some pretty significant long-term consequences. One of the reasons that Constantine builds Constantinople isn't because of malignant narcissism or because he really likes beachfront property in basically eastern Turkey or western Turkey. One reason is because the empire is too big to effectively manage. Communication basically travels at the speed of horse or boat. So if you're trying to administer the entire empire, you need it's impossible to do that from one central location. So what happens is the Roman Empire tries a number of different systems to kind of divide the empire up while still sort of maintaining a cohesive whole. So there is an Eastern Empire and Western Empire. They try a few different variations of this. The problem is that almost inevitably all the imperial leaders end up becoming suspicious of each other, and many times they end up trying to kill one another. So let's call off the Roman Empire. So one reason for the decline of the Roman Empire seems to have been this period of intense migrations as people from central China start to move westwards into Europe. That displaces more people, and a lot of people, especially Germanic people, they're actually fleeing into the empire for protection. Now, I know that this probably kind of gives you the sense that this is like Vikings coming in and marauding and raiding, but actually no. A lot of these people were Romanized. Maybe they spoke Latin or Greek as a second language. These are certainly not people who want to destroy the Roman Empire. The problem is that the Roman state often, it will sometimes accept those refugees. It'll sometimes actually repel them, and sometimes it'll actually fight them to ensure that they get out. What happens is there are a few incredibly devastating wars that the Roman Empire fights against the people who actually want to immigrate inside of it. The great decisive loss that basically destroys the Roman army is the Battle of Adrianople, fought between the Romans and the Goths, and not those Goths, by the way. And the Goths win, but it's very tragic, because all war is tragic, but especially the pointlessness of it, because the Goths were people who actually didn't want to destroy Rome, they wanted to join it. Most of the people who end up destroying Rome are kind of Roman fanboys and fangirls. You have decreased money flow, you have decline in trade, also you have an imbalance in trade. The other thing is that with the division of the empire in two, the western half of the empire isn't as, let's just say that it's a bit run down. The eastern part of the empire is fairly wealthy, but the western part, that's where like the old imperial capital is, and they just don't have the resources or the tax base to basically stay afloat. So eventually in 476, the Western Roman Empire falls. I'm not going to say that the Roman Empire itself declines, because the eastern part of the empire, it's still doing okay. In fact, the eastern part of the empire is going to last for another 1,000 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire. For reasons we might talk about a little bit later, it was in the interest of many Europeans and European historians to minimize the fact that there was this whole other empire over here in Turkey that continued to call themselves Romans. But from 476 up until 1453, you have an empire based in Constantinople, basically governed by people who thought of themselves as Romans. So let's recap at the Greco-Roman world, because basically Rome and Greece, they become like peanut butter and jelly, and they combine, and the sum is greater than the totality of the parts. So on the one hand, you have this spread of Greek philosophy. The Romans kind of add on to it with things like Stoicism and Epicureanism. You have the spread of Greek mathematics, Euclidean geometry, the Pythagorean theorem, advances in astronomy. You have basically the expansion of a literary style that we know as the style that the Iliad and the Odyssey are written in. My third period is coming in here, so I'm going to have to kind of book it. So the Romans, they had concrete. Look at that concrete. It's pretty sweet. Also, we talked a lot about the polytheistic religions of the Greeks and the Romans, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. The other thing is, take a note of the large slave population. Sometimes it could be as high as 50%. Other times it's roughly like 1/3. This is something shared by both the Greeks and the Romans. And also, if you remember Confucianism, which is basically love your dad's dad, and love the state, the Romans basically have a very similar system called paterfamilias, which basically means that you have to obey the whims and the wishes of the oldest dude in the family, even if that's your great-granddad. Oh, and if you defy him, you'll probably die. Have a good day, by the way.